My name is Ella. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been the woman people describe with words like steady, reasonable, and low maintenance. I work in a role where you're rewarded for keeping things moving without being seen, where calm is mistaken for compliance, and reliability is often confused with availability. If you asked the people around me back then who I was, they would have said I was lucky, married, settled, safe. What they didn't say, what they never noticed, was how easy it was to underestimate me. I've always been quiet in a way that makes people project onto me. They assume you agree. They assume you don't mind. They assume you won't look too closely, won't ask the second question, won't connect the dots if doing so might make things uncomfortable. I let them think that, not because I was afraid, but because I was raised to believe that harmony mattered more than being right. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about exposing someone for entertainment or turning pain into spectacle. It's about what happens when you stay observant while everyone else assumes you're oblivious. It's about emotional justice, not the loud kind, not the kind that needs witnesses, but the kind that arrives quietly after the truth has been fully understood. At its surface, my story can be summarized in two sentences that still feel unreal when I say them out loud. I discovered my marriage was used to secure permanent residency. The divorce was filed the same day, and the approval notice arrived in the morning. The breakup text came at night. But this isn't a story about paperwork or immigration alone. It's about the slow erosion that happens long before a final betrayal. It's about the small dismissals that seem harmless in isolation, the roles we accept without realizing we've been assigned them, and the moment, quiet, internal, almost invisible, when something shifts and you stop explaining other people's behavior at the expense of your own clarity. I'm telling this now because distance has given me perspective, not because time has softened the truth. I won't dramatize what doesn't need drama. I won't exaggerate what was already sharp enough. And I won't pretend I was perfect. I stayed longer than I should have. I rationalized things that deserve scrutiny. I believed in intentions more than patterns, until patterns became impossible to ignore. What follows is not a single explosion, but a series of realizations, a psychological reversal that didn't announce itself until it was already complete. If you're listening to this because you've ever felt quietly used, quietly sidelined, or quietly underestimated, this story is for you. Before we begin, let me ask you something gently, without pressure. Have you ever looked back on a relationship and realized the most important moment wasn't when it ended, but when you finally saw it clearly? To them, I was easy. Not easy in the careless way people whisper about, but easy in the way systems love. Predictable, dependable, quietly absorbing weight so others don't have to feel it. I was the woman who remembered deadlines without reminders, who filled in gaps before anyone noticed there was a gap, who smoothed conversations before tension had a chance to surface. I was the one you could lean on without asking permission. In my marriage, that role followed me home. I was the organizer of our shared life, the one who knew which bills were due and which forms needed signatures, the one who researched neighborhoods, health insurance options, and renewal dates. When people asked how we were doing, he would smile and say, "We're good. Ella takes care of things." It was meant as a compliment. Everyone laughed. I smiled too. No one asked what things meant. To his friends, I was supportive. To his family, I was polite and undemanding. The kind of partner who didn't make scenes, didn't ask for much, didn't complicate gatherings with opinions that required adjustment. I blended in easily, which people mistook for belonging. At work, it was similar. I was the calm one in meetings, the person who didn't rush to speak, but when I did, it was to clarify, to connect dots, to translate tension into something workable. People trusted me because I didn't need credit. Or at least, that's what they thought. What they didn't see was that I noticed everything. I noticed how often my preferences were deferred. Just this once, I noticed how decisions were made in rooms I wasn't invited into, then explained to me as if they were inevitable. I noticed how gratitude slowly replaced reciprocity. But I didn't react. I didn't correct the narrative. Because invisibility, when chosen, can feel like control. And I believed, naively, that being reasonable would eventually be recognized as being equal. In my marriage, I was perceived as the stable axis, the emotional adult. If there was conflict, it was assumed I would be the one to soften first. If there was stress, it was understood I could handle it. He would say things like, "You're stronger than me," or "You're just better at this stuff." Again, compliments. Again, I accepted them without asking why strength was always required of me, and never of him. I became the translator between his anxieties and the world, the buffer, the proof that everything was fine. And because I rarely complained, people assumed I had nothing to complain about. There's a particular kind of invisibility that comes from competence. When you do things well and quietly, your effort disappears into expectation. When you don't demand reassurance, people stop offering it. When you carry responsibility gracefully, no one thinks to ask whether it should be shared. I don't say this with bitterness. At the time, I believed this was adulthood, that love looked like patience, that partnership meant compensating for each other's weaknesses, that if something felt slightly off, it was my job to adjust, not to question the structure itself. So I adjusted. I learned how to phrase concerns gently enough that they sounded like suggestions. I learned how to pause before speaking, to give him space, to let things pass if they weren't important enough. I learned how to be indispensable without being demanding. What I didn't realize then was that every role you accept teaches people how to treat you. And once that role is set, it becomes very difficult for others to imagine you as anything else. To them, I was the background constant, the reliable framework around which more important stories could unfold. I wasn't dramatic enough to be memorable. I wasn't difficult enough to be feared. I wasn't needy enough to be prioritized. I was useful, and for a long time, I mistook that for being loved. Looking back, the signs weren't loud. There were no raised voices, no obvious cruelty, just a quiet assumption that I would be there, unchanged regardless of what was taken or decided. At that stage, I still believed my invisibility was harmless, even noble. I didn't yet understand that it was instructional. The first small cut never announces itself as a wound. It arrives dressed as practicality, as timing, as something that would be unreasonable to make a fuss about. And that's why everyone else misses it. Because on the surface, nothing bad has happened. Nothing justifies discomfort. For me, it was a conversation that ended before I realized it had begun. We were sitting at the kitchen table, papers spread out between us. Immigration forms mostly, renewal timelines, requirements, and things that needed signatures. I had spent the afternoon cross-checking details, highlighting sections that mattered, and making notes in the margins so nothing would be missed. It was my habit, not because he asked, but because that's how I approach shared responsibilities. At one point, I paused and said carefully, "I think we should talk about how long this ties us together legally. Not just the process, but us." He didn't look up right away, just nodded, absently, as if agreeing to a weather report. Then he said, "Let's not overthink it. We're already married. This is just paperwork." Just paperwork. The words landed softly, too softly to bruise, but they stayed. I remember waiting for something to follow, a question maybe, or reassurance, something that acknowledged what I was actually asking. Instead, he slid the papers back toward me and said, "Can you handle the rest of this? You're better at it." And that was it. Conversation over. Not argued, not rejected, simply bypassed. No one else would have noticed anything wrong with that moment. If I'd told a friend, they might have shrugged and said, "He trusts you," or "He's stressed," or "You're reading too much into it." And at the time, I agreed. I told myself the same things. I even felt a flicker of pride. He needs me. I'm competent. I'm holding this together. But something had shifted. It wasn't what he said. It was what he didn't say. He didn't ask how I felt about the weight of it. He didn't acknowledge that marriage, in this context, carried consequences that went far beyond love. He didn't engage with the idea that my life was also being shaped by this process. He had treated our marriage as a means, temporary, functional, administrative, and I had let him. That night, nothing dramatic happened. We ate dinner, we talked about work, we went to bed at our usual time. On the surface, everything was normal, but internally, I replayed that sentence, just paperwork, over and over, trying to place why it felt wrong. I didn't confront him. I didn't even journal about it. I filed it away in the same mental drawer where I kept all the other moments that felt slightly misaligned but not serious enough to name. That's how the first small cut works. It relies on your generosity, on your willingness to contextualize someone else's behavior before examining its impact on you. It thrives in relationships where you're accustomed to being the one who understands. In the weeks that followed, I noticed tiny adjustments in myself. I stopped bringing up certain topic. I preemptively simplified questions so they wouldn't require emotional engagement. I took on more of the administrative load without asking whether it was fair. From the outside, it looked like harmony. Inside, it felt like narrowing. What stayed with me wasn't anger. It was a faint, persistent awareness that something important had been dismissed too easily. I had offered a moment of reflection, and it had been declined without discussion. And the most unsettling part wasn't that he hadn't noticed the cut. It was that I had and still chose silence. Because at that stage, I believed that love meant smoothing over small discomforts, that mature relationships didn't linger on feelings, that being low maintenance was a virtue. I didn't know yet that this was the beginning of a pattern, that the smallest dismissals, when repeated, don't fade. They accumulate quietly, patiently, and they change the shape of things long before anyone realizes they've been altered. Once the first small cut heals without acknowledgement, the body learns a dangerous lesson. This is survivable. That's how it began to normalize. There wasn't a single moment when I thought, I am being disrespected. Instead, there were dozens of moments where I thought, this isn't ideal, but it's not worth turning into a problem. And because nothing exploded, because there was no obvious harm, I told myself I was choosing peace. In reality, I was choosing familiarity. He began to assume my availability in ways that felt subtle enough to excuse. Plans would change without discussion. Decisions would be announced instead of made together. When I asked questions, they were met with explanations rather than consideration, as if the outcome was already settled, and my role was simply to understand why. You're overthinking it, he'd say, not unkindly. This is just how these things work. Trust me. Trust became shorthand for don't look too closely. I noticed how often my discomfort was reframed as inefficiency. If I wanted to talk something through, it was labeled as unnecessary stress. If I hesitated, it was framed as doubt. If I asked for clarity, it was met with reassurance instead of answers. And because I was calm, because I didn't raise my voice or demand space, my concerns were treated as optional, like annotations, not core text. The most unsettling part was how easy it was to rationalize staying quiet. I told myself he was under pressure. Immigration processes are stressful, I reasoned. He was navigating uncertainty. My steadiness helped him. That's what partners do. They balance each other. I reminded myself of the good days, the shared jokes, the history we'd built. I compared him not to an ideal partner, but to worse stories I'd heard, and by that measure, things seemed fine. That's how disrespect survives. Not through cruelty, but through comparison. There were moments, small, precise ones, when I felt myself shrink just slightly, like when he spoke about our future in abstract terms that didn't include my goals, or when he thanked me for handling things in front of others, as if my contribution was logistical rather than personal, or when he made plans that depended on my flexibility without ever checking if I had limits. Each time, I adjusted. I softened. I explained myself better. I tried to be clearer, kinder, and more patient. I believed that if I communicated well enough, the imbalance would resolve itself. What I didn't see yet was that I was the only one doing the adjusting. Over time, silence stopped feeling like a choice and started feeling like a reflex. I learned which topics led nowhere. I learned which questions were better left unasked. I learned how to read his mood and time my needs accordingly, as if my feelings were requests that required optimal conditions. And because I was capable, because I didn't fall apart, no one worried about me. Friends would say, "You're so strong," when I hinted at being tired. Coworkers would joke that I was unflappable. Even he would say, "I don't know how you manage everything so well." What they didn't realize was that strength, when unreciprocated, becomes isolation. I wasn't being mistreated in ways that were easy to point to. There were no insults, no threats, no obvious betrayals, just a steady erosion of mutuality, a quiet recentering of the relationship around his needs, his timeline, his outcomes. And because I could handle it, I did. That's the trap of normalizing disrespect. You mistake endurance for virtue. You confuse the absence of conflict with the presence of respect. You learn to live slightly off center and call it compromise. Looking back now, I can see how my silence trained him. Not maliciously, not consciously, but clearly. It taught him that my boundaries were flexible, that my needs were negotiable, that my role was to support the structure, not question it. At the time, I still believed this was temporary, that once the stress passed, balance would return. that love, once relieved of pressure, would naturally recalibrate. I didn't yet understand that patterns don't dissolve on their own. They solidify, and by the time you notice, they already feel normal to everyone except you. There's a moment in every unbalanced relationship when you realize you're no longer improvising, you're performing. I didn't notice it all at once. It revealed itself in how predictably I was needed and how rarely I was considered. I had become a role more than a person, a function, a stabilizer. Reliable, useful, invisible. That was who I was expected to be. I could feel it in this way conversations bent around me instead of toward me. If something went wrong, eyes turned to me, not with concern, but with expectation. If something needed fixing, organizing, or clarifying, I was already halfway there before anyone asked. My competence had become a given, not a gift. And in my marriage, that role had a very specific shape. I was the responsible one, the planner, the emotional regulator. If he felt overwhelmed, I simplified things. If he felt uncertain, I reassured him. If he withdrew, I waited. The unspoken agreement was clear. I would carry the structure, and he would occupy the center. What unsettled me wasn't that I was needed. It was that my needs had quietly exited the frame. I remember realizing this during a conversation with a friend. She asked casually, "What are you excited about this year?" And I opened my mouth and stalled. Not because I lacked ambition, but because I had stopped framing the future in terms of myself. My plans were nested inside his, conditional, adaptable. It startled me how natural that had felt. The role I had been assigned didn't come with cruelty. It came with praise, with trust, with statements like, "I couldn't do this without you, and you're the backbone of everything." Those words are seductive. They sound like appreciation, but over time, they create a hierarchy where one person is essential infrastructure and the other is free to move. Infrastructure doesn't get consulted, it gets relied upon. I began to notice how rarely he checked in about my limits, how decisions were framed as fait accompli, how my agreement was assumed, not requested. If I hesitated, it was treated as an obstacle to be managed rather than information to be respected. And still, I stayed composed because I had learned that disruption was unbecoming, that being difficult would undermine the very stability I was praised for providing. So I adapted. I spoke less about what I wanted and more about what made sense. I framed my needs as logistics. I waited for the right moment, which somehow never arrived. I told myself this was a phase. Once the process we were in concluded, once the pressure lifted, we would rebalance. But roles once internalized don't dissolve on their own. The clearest sign came in a small, almost forgettable exchange. He was talking about an upcoming decision, one that affected both of us, and he said, "I'll let you know what I decide." Not we, not us. I. He said it without malice, without awareness, as if it were the most natural phrasing in the world. And I felt something settle. It wasn't anger, it was recognition. I saw in that moment how I existed in the narrative of our relationship. I was support, not a stakeholder. Facilitator, not equal. My presence was assumed, my consent implied. I had been assigned the role of the steady background, while someone else lived in the foreground. What's difficult to admit is that I had helped write that script by being endlessly adaptable, by prioritizing ease over equity, by believing that love meant making myself smaller when necessary. But recognition is powerful. Once you see the role, you can't unsee it. I didn't confront him. Not yet. I didn't announce my realization or demand a rewrite. I simply stopped telling myself comforting stories about why things were the way they were. I began to observe not with hurt, but with clarity. And that clarity marked the end of my innocence in the relationship. Because once you understand the role you're playing, you have a choice: continue performing it or step out of the frame. At that moment, I didn't know which I would choose, but I knew I could no longer pretend the role didn't exist. The day something shifted didn't look important while it was happening. There was no argument, no raised voice, no dramatic revelation. In fact, if you asked him to describe that day, he probably wouldn't remember it at all. That's how quiet the shift was. It happened entirely inside me, in a space no one else was watching. It was a weekday morning. Ordinary. I was at my desk, coffee cooling beside me, scanning through emails before a meeting. Among them was a notification I hadn't expected. Not alarming, not urgent, just a routine update connected to the immigration process we'd been navigating for months. I opened it without thinking much of it. As I read, I felt a familiar sense of responsibility kick in. I began mentally organizing next steps, deadlines, and follow ups. This was what I did. This was my reflex, but halfway through, I stopped. Not because of what the email said, but because of what it assumed. It assumed my involvement without acknowledging my agency. It treated my marriage not as a relationship, but as a mechanism, a completed requirement, something already settled, already secure. And suddenly, with startling clarity, I realized how often I had been operating from that same assumption, that my role was to ensure outcomes, that my feelings were secondary to processes, that my presence was a given, not a choice. I leaned back in my chair and felt something loosen. Not break, loosen. Like a knot you didn't realize you'd been carrying until it finally gives way. For the first time, I asked myself a question I hadn't allowed before. If I weren't useful here, what would remain? The answer didn't come immediately, but the silence that followed was honest. Later that evening, we talked casually about our days. He mentioned something he was planning, an assumption about the future, phrased as certainty. I listened, nodding automatically, and then I felt it again. That quiet misalignment, the sense that decisions were being made with my participation presumed rather than chosen. Normally, I would have smoothed it over, asked clarifying questions, adjusted expectations gently. But that night, I didn't. I didn't challenge him. I didn't agree either. I simply said, I need some time to think about that. The words were calm, neutral, unremarkable. But inside, something irreversible had begun. For the first time, my silence wasn't reflexive. It was intentional. I wasn't swallowing discomfort to maintain harmony. I was creating space. And in that space, I began to notice how quickly others rush to fill it when they're accustomed to your constant availability. He looked surprised. Not offended, just slightly disoriented, as if a familiar piece of furniture had been moved a few inches to the left. Okay, he said after a pause, let me know. And I did something I'd never done before. I didn't reassure him. That night, lying awake, I replayed not just recent conversations, but months, years of interactions. Patterns sharpened, not into accusations, but into understanding. I saw how my steadiness had enabled imbalance, how my willingness to adapt had insulated him from ever needing to reflect. And I felt something unexpected, calm. Not the calm of avoidance, but the calm that comes when you stop negotiating with reality, when you stop explaining away what you already understand. I realized that I didn't need to confront him yet. I didn't need to announce my awakening. I didn't need to change anything externally. The shift was internal, and that was enough. From that day on, I began to move differently. I listened more than I spoke. I answered questions precisely, without padding. I stopped volunteering solutions. I let silence exist without rescuing it. And in doing so, I began to see the relationship as it was, not as I hoped it would become. The power of that shift wasn't in what I did next. It was what I stopped doing automatically. I stopped assuming responsibility for outcomes that weren't mine alone. I stopped translating his needs at the expense of my own clarity. Most importantly, I stopped fearing what might happen if I didn't hold everything together. Because for the first time, I understood something fundamental. If a structure collapses when you step back, it wasn't balanced to begin with. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me free. Once silence stops being a reflex, it becomes a tool. I didn't announce the change. I didn't explain myself. I simply began choosing when to speak and when not to. And that choice altered the entire dynamic in ways I hadn't anticipated. At first, nothing dramatic happened. Conversations continued. Routines held. From the outside, our life looked unchanged. But internally, I was no longer filling gaps automatically. When he spoke in generalities, I didn't translate them into plans. When something was implied, I waited to see if it would be clarified. When a decision affected both of us, I paused instead of nodding. That pause was new. People underestimate how unsettling a pause can be when they're accustomed to your immediate accommodation. Silence creates a mirror. It reflects assumptions back to the person making them. He began to repeat himself more often, adding details he hadn't volunteered before. He asked, "Does that make sense?" A question he'd rarely asked me. Not because I was confused, but because I was usually compliant. Still, he interpreted my quiet as stress, or fatigue, or a temporary distraction. He didn't see it as resistance, and that misinterpretation worked in my favor. Because silence, when chosen, allows you to observe without revealing your position. I started noticing things with sharper precision. The way he framed his future plans increasingly around singular outcomes. The way he spoke about after everything settles, as if that settlement was the end goal, not a transition. The way my presence was referenced was in supportive terms, but rarely in decisive ones. I began documenting, not obsessively, not emotionally, just clearly. Dates, conversations, phrases that stood out. Not because I was building a case yet, but because clarity requires memory, and memory is fragile when you've spent years explaining things away. What surprised me most was how quickly others mistook my quiet for weakness. Friends commented that I seemed less intense. Family members said I looked tired. He suggested I take a break, travel, and relax. Everyone assumed my withdrawal meant depletion. No one considered that it might mean discernment. There's a particular advantage in being underestimated at this stage. When people believe you're retreating, they stop guarding themselves, they speak more freely, they reveal priorities without editing, they assume the structure will hold, because it always has. And so, without confrontation, I learned more than I ever could have through argument. I noticed how often my silence prompted him to center himself more fully. He filled space with his own needs, his own timelines, his own anxieties, not out of malice, but out of habit, the habit of being held. Each time I felt my resolve strengthen, not into anger, but into alignment. I was no longer negotiating with his version of events. I was simply observing the truth of them. I also noticed something else, how calm I felt. There was no more internal debate. No more rehearsing conversations that would never happen. No more emotional labor spent making things smoother. My energy returned to me, not as excitement, but as steadiness. Silence became a boundary I didn't have to explain, and boundaries that don't require explanation are the hardest to argue with. One evening, he asked, almost casually, "Is everything okay with us?" I considered the question carefully. In the past, I would have rushed to reassure him, to soften whatever uncertainty he was feeling. That night, I answered honestly, but not fully. "I'm paying attention," I said. He laughed lightly, unsure what to do with that. "You always do." And that was the moment I realized something crucial. He still thought he knew me. He didn't yet understand that the version of me who carried everything quietly had stepped back, that the silence he was experiencing wasn't absence, it was assessment. I wasn't punishing him. I wasn't testing him. I wasn't planning an exit yet. I was choosing to see clearly. And clarity, once gained, changes the stakes entirely, because when you stop speaking to be understood and start listening to understand, the truth has nowhere to hide. From that point on, silence wasn't about endurance. It was about position. What they never noticed was how much I was learning while saying very little. Silence gave me time. Not idle time, clean time. Time unclouded by emotional justification or self-doubt. I wasn't trying to fix anything anymore, which meant my attention was no longer split between observation and preservation. I could finally see the full picture without feeling responsible for protecting it. I began preparing, not in the dramatic sense, not with secret plans or rehearsed exits. Preparation for me looked like information, documentation, understanding systems the same way I always had, only this time I was doing it for myself. I revisited paperwork I'd previously handled on autopilot. I read policies fully instead of skimming for deadlines. I noticed phrasing I'd glossed over before, language that clarified rights, obligations, timelines. Not just his, but mine. I started separating facts from assumptions. What was legally required? What was emotionally implied? What was optional, but treated as inevitable? Those distinctions mattered more than I had ever realized. At work, this kind of analysis was second nature to me. I had built a career on anticipating risk and closing gaps before they became problems. But in my personal life, I had rarely applied that same rigor. Love, I'd believed, required a different logic. I was wrong. I began quietly organizing my records, financial contributions, shared assets, communication trails, not because I intended to weaponize them, but because clarity demands completeness. And completeness is impossible when memory is selective. What surprised me was how little resistance I encountered. No one questioned my actions. No one noticed the shift in focus. To them, I was still the same capable presence, just quieter, less demanding. That's the advantage of a long-established role. People don't check what's underneath it. He continued to speak openly about his plans, his relief at how things were finally stabilizing. He talked about future possibilities with a confidence that hadn't been there before. And in those conversations, I heard something new. Not hope, but certainty. Certainty that didn't include curiosity about me. I noticed how often he referred to after. After approval, after resolution, after everything settled. As if the purpose of the present was merely to endure until that milestone was reached. And I realized that for him, that milestone wasn't a checkpoint. It was an endpoint. That understanding didn't hurt the way betrayal is supposed to hurt. It clarified. It rearranged things internally. It explained why my role had narrowed so efficiently. Why had my personhood had been secondary to my function? I wasn't his partner in uncertainty. I was his stabilizing factor through transition. And transitions, once complete, don't need stabilizers. While he moved forward, assuming continuity, I positioned myself for autonomy. I consulted quietly, asked neutral questions, learned what options existed without signaling intent. I made sure I understood consequences, not just emotional ones, but structural ones. Every answer I received reinforced the same truth. I had more agency than I had been exercising. And that realization was sobering, because it meant that what I had endured wasn't inevitability. It was choice, not a conscious choice, but a conditioned one. The kind you make when you believe harmony requires self-erasure. As I prepared, I also paid attention to myself, to how my body responded when I imagined different futures. One where I stayed, one where I left, one where nothing changed except my internal posture. Only one of those futures felt calm, not exciting, not vindicated, calm. I didn't share any of this. Not with friends, not with family, not with him. Silence protected the process. It kept my clarity intact, unpolluted by opinions or premature reassurance. And still, nothing in my behavior signaled disruption. I didn't withdraw affection. I didn't escalate tension. I didn't create distance. I simply stopped compensating. That alone revealed more than confrontation ever could. He never noticed the shift from assumption to evidence, from participation to assessment, from endurance to positioning, because to him, everything still worked. The structure still held, the support was still there. He didn't see that I was no longer holding it up. I was standing beside it, hands-free, evaluating whether it deserved to stand at all low. By the time I reached clarity, there was no rush, no urgency, just readiness. And readiness is invisible to those who mistake silence for submission. The private reveal didn't arrive with shock. There was no gasp, no moment where the room seemed to tilt, no cinematic pause where everything suddenly made sense. When the truth finally surfaced in full, it did so quietly, almost politely, as if it had been waiting for me to be ready to see it without flinching. It was a morning like any other. I was alone, sitting at the same desk where so many of my realizations had begun, coffee in hand, laptop open. I had logged in to check a status update, something procedural, something I had checked dozens of times before. Habitual, automatic. And then I saw it, the approval notice, clear, formal, final. For a moment, I simply stared at the screen, not because I didn't understand what it meant, but because I understood it too well. This was the milestone, the endpoint he had been orienting everything around, the thing that would make the waiting worth it. I felt nothing dramatic, no relief, no anger, no rush of vindication, just clarity. Because in that moment, a series of small, previously disconnected observations aligned into a single, undeniable pattern. His increased certainty, his forward-looking plans, the way my role had narrowed as the process progressed, the absence of curiosity about us beyond the outcome. The approval notice didn't change anything. It confirmed everything. I didn't tell him right away. Not out of strategy, not out of spite. I simply needed to sit with the truth without interference, to experience it privately without managing anyone else's emotions. I closed the laptop and sat there, breathing slowly, noticing how calm my body felt. That calm was important. It told me something I needed to trust. Later that day, he texted me, casual, almost light. "Hey, did you see the update?" I looked at the message for a long moment before responding. "Yes," I wrote. "I saw it." He replied with enthusiasm, gratitude, a kind of buoyancy that hadn't been there before. He talked about relief, about how everything could finally move forward now. He used words like finally and settled and secure. I read each message carefully, not for hidden meaning, but for emphasis. What struck me most was what wasn't there. No acknowledgement of what this had cost me. No reflection on what we had endured together. No question about how I was feeling. The narrative was complete without my interiority. That was the reveal. Not that he had planned to leave me in a malicious, premeditated way. Not that our marriage had been a conscious scheme from the start. Reality was subtler and more damning. I had been essential to the process, but optional to the outcome. Once the requirement was fulfilled, the structure no longer needed reinforcement. And he, consciously or not, had already shifted into a future where my presence was assumed only insofar as it remained convenient. Understanding that distinction changed everything. It meant I didn't need proof of bad intent. I didn't need to argue about love, or motives, or memory. The alignment of actions told the story more accurately than any confession could. That evening, the second sentence of this story arrived. The breakup text came at night. It was brief, carefully worded, almost gentle. He said he'd been thinking, that he felt we had grown apart, that the stress of the process had revealed fundamental differences, that it would be better to end things now, cleanly, respectfully. I read it once, then again, and then I set the phone down. There was no spike of pain, no urge to respond immediately, just a deep, steady confirmation that the clarity I'd reached that morning had been correct. The timing was exact, approval in the morning, separation at night, not coincidental, not dramatic, just precise. I didn't cry, I didn't pace, I didn't call anyone. I sat quietly and let the truth settle fully into place. This was the moment many people imagine as explosive. The betrayal revealed, the confrontation ignited. But for me, it was the opposite. It was the most emotionally stable moment I had experienced in months. Because I wasn't losing something I believed in anymore. I had already let go of the illusion. The reveal wasn't about what he had done. It was about what I now understood. That my silence had not been weakness. That my patience had not been blind. That my calm had not been consent. And that whatever came next would be chosen, not endured. I didn't reply that night. There was nothing left to explain. There's a particular stillness that comes after clarity, not the numb kind, not the stunned aftermath people expect, but a deliberate quiet, where emotion steps aside long enough for choice to enter the room. That was where I found myself after the text. Not grieving yet, not strategizing in panic, just standing at a clean intersection, aware that whatever I chose next would set a permanent direction. I didn't respond that night. That alone was a decision. In the past, I would have answered immediately, carefully, thoughtfully, trying to preserve dignity on both sides. I would have asked questions, sought understanding, tried to turn an ending into a conversation. But that impulse didn't rise this time. Not because I was shutting down, but because there was nothing left to negotiate. The truth had already finished speaking. The next morning, I woke up early. The house was quiet, familiar in a way that felt temporary. I made coffee and sat by the window, watching the city wake up, and I considered my options. Not emotionally, but structurally. I could confront him, demand explanations, ask him to admit what the timing suggested. I could try to salvage something, extend the conversation, propose counseling, insist on closure that looked like dialogue. I could also disappear emotionally, withdraw without clarity, let the ending stretch into ambiguity, or I could choose finality. Not revenge, not exposure, not punishment. Finality. I thought about what each option would cost me, not in pride, but in energy, in time, in alignment with who I had become over the past months of quiet observation. Confrontation would give him a stage. It would invite defensiveness, reframing, and selective memory. It would pull me back into a dynamic where my role was to manage emotions. His, not mine. Silence without structure would keep me tethered. It would invite follow-up messages, half-closures, and unresolved threads, a slow bleed of attention. Finality, on the other hand, would require precision, calm, commitment. It would mean acting without spectacle and without delay. By the time the sun was fully up, I knew which option was irreversible. I consulted a professional that afternoon, not to ask what I should do emotionally, but to understand what I could do practically. I asked questions the way I always had, clearly, thoroughly, without revealing more than necessary. What are the timelines? What are the implications? What happens if I proceed now? The answers were straightforward. So was the conclusion. Waiting would not benefit me. Explaining would not protect me. And hoping for acknowledgement would not change the facts. That evening, I drafted a response. Not reactive, not detailed, not emotional. Measured. I acknowledged the message. I agreed that the marriage was over. I stated that I would be filing for divorce immediately and that further communication should go through appropriate channels. No accusations, no arguments, no questions. Just a statement of action. Before sending it, I paused, not to reconsider, but to check in with myself. I scanned for hesitation, for grief masquerading as doubt. What I found instead was steadiness, the kind that doesn't ask for validation. I sent the message. The decision point passed without ceremony. No dramatic music, no witnesses, just a quiet crossing from one reality into another. Later, when I learned that the divorce filing and the approval date shared the same calendar day, people would call it symbolic, poetic, even brutal. But in truth, it wasn't symbolic at all. It was aligned. One chapter had ended the moment it fulfilled its function. I simply refused to let the aftermath linger longer than necessary. That was the irreversible choice. Not to fight for an explanation, but to honor the clarity I'd earned. To choose myself without needing anyone else to agree. And once that choice was made, everything else became procedural. Not easy, but clean. Once the decision was made, I moved the same way I always had. Quietly, methodically, without spectacle. From the outside, nothing seemed to change at first. I still went to work. I still answered messages when necessary. I still showed up on time, met deadlines, and kept my voice level. There were no dramatic exits, no late night calls, no visible unraveling. That was intentional. I understood something very clearly now. The moment you announce your intention, you invite interference. Opinions, delays, emotional negotiations disguised as concern. I had spent enough of my life cushioning other people from discomfort. I wasn't going to do that here. So I moved in silence. The legal steps were straightforward. Paperwork filed, accounts reviewed, boundaries clarified. I didn't rush, but I didn't hesitate either. Every action was taken with the same calm precision I brought to my professional life. This wasn't about winning, it was about closing. I separated what needed separating. Documents, finances, responsibilities. I made lists, not out of anxiety, but out of respect for accuracy. I double-checked details. I asked questions when something wasn't clear. I didn't explain myself beyond what was required. He, on the other hand, seemed unsettled. Not angry, not combative, just confused. He sent messages that hovered at the edges of concern, asked if we could talk things through, suggested we didn't need to be so formal so quickly. His tone was careful, almost cautious, as if he were unsure which version of me he was speaking to. I didn't respond to everything. When I did, I kept it neutral, polite, brief. That restraint wasn't coldness, it was containment, because I knew that any emotional openness would be interpreted as uncertainty, and uncertainty invites persuasion. I wasn't interested in being persuaded, not because I was inflexible, but because I had already done the work of understanding. What struck me most during this period was how invisible my actions remained to everyone else. Friends assumed we were working things out. Family members noticed I was quieter, but attributed it to stress. At work, no one suspected anything at all. The absence of drama made my resolve harder to detect, and that was the point. There's a misconception that strength has to announce itself, that empowerment is loud, that clarity demands declaration. But some of the most consequential changes happen under the radar, while everyone else assumes continuity. I packed what was mine without comment. I adjusted routines without explanation. I redirected the mail, updated records, changed passwords, not in panic, not in secrecy, just in sequence. Each step was small, manageable, almost boring, and yet, together, they formed something unrecognizable from the life I'd been living before. I noticed how much energy I had now that I wasn't managing anyone else's reactions, how my thoughts felt sharper, my sleep deeper, how the constant low-grade vigilance I'd lived with for years had quietly dissolved. Silence protected that. There were moments, brief ones, when he tried to re-enter emotionally, to reminisce, to soften the narrative, to frame the ending as mutual confusion rather than clear divergence. I didn't correct him. Correction implies debate. Debate implies uncertainty. Instead, I let actions speak. Deadlines were met. Processes advanced. The structure moved forward without needing my emotional participation. That was when the imbalance truly revealed itself. Because while I was moving cleanly through the mechanics of separation, he seemed stalled, caught between relief and loss, certainty and surprise. He hadn't expected decisiveness from me. He hadn't anticipated that I would choose resolution over reconciliation without prompting. He mistook my previous patience for permanence. Moving in silence allowed me to exit the narrative without rewriting it for him. I didn't need him to understand. I didn't need agreement. I didn't even need acknowledgement. I needed completion. And completion doesn't require noise. It requires follow-through. By the time others began to sense that something was final, Most of the work was already done. The foundation had shifted. The future had been rerouted. Quietly, deliberately, irreversibly. Consequences rarely arrive all at once. They ripple, subtle at first, almost deniable, and then gradually, they reshape the emotional landscape until the absence of what once existed becomes impossible to ignore. At the beginning, he didn't seem to register what was happening. The processes were moving, yes, but in his mind they still felt theoretical. Paperwork, formalities, things that could be slowed down, softened, reinterpreted. He spoke as though we were still in a shared holding pattern, waiting for emotions to catch up with logistics. I wasn't. The first consequence was silence, not the strategic kind I had chosen before, but the kind that emerges when access is gone. I no longer filled his days with responsiveness. I no longer absorbed uncertainty on his behalf. I no longer translated his discomfort into reassurance. And that absence created friction he didn't know how to name. He reached out more often, not dramatically, not desperately, just more. Messages that didn't require answers, observations without purpose, questions he could have answered himself. It wasn't reconciliation he was seeking, it was orientation. For a long time, I had been the point of reference, the person who made things make sense. Without that, he seemed unsteady, unsure of how to locate himself inside the change he'd initiated. That was the second consequence, disorientation. Not regret yet, not panic, just a growing awareness that the structure he relied on was no longer available. Those things were happening without his input. Those outcomes were proceeding without his emotional readiness. He began to realize that the ending was not a conversation. It was a process already underway, and processes don't wait for comfort. Friends noticed next, subtly at first. Invitations that assumed we'd arrive together had to be corrected. Questions were asked carefully, indirectly, as if probing for the version of events that would make the most sense. I didn't offer one. I said we had separated. I said it was final. I didn't explain why. The lack of narrative unsettled people more than any accusation could have. They looked for cues, anger, sadness, bitterness, and found none, just composure. That composure carried weight because it disrupted the familiar script. There was no villain to react against, no dramatic collapse to comfort, just a quiet certainty that something had ended for reasons that didn't need to be justified publicly. For him, the consequences deepened as reality caught up with assumption. He began to ask practical questions about timelines, about next steps, about whether things could be paused, not reversed, just slowed, as if delay might soften the impact. I answered when required. I didn't know it wasn't. Each unanswered message wasn't a punishment. It was a boundary asserting itself without explanation. That's when I noticed a shift in his tone, less confidence, more caution, a carefulness that hadn't been there before. He was no longer speaking from the center, he was orbiting, unsure of how close he was allowed to come. He had assumed continuity because continuity had always been provided. Now he was experiencing what happens when support is withdrawn without drama. The emotional labor I had carried for years had been invisible while present. Its absence, however, was unmistakable. That was the third consequence, awareness, not of wrongdoing but of dependence. And awareness, when delayed, often arrives as discomfort rather than insight. I felt no satisfaction watching this unfold, no vindication, just confirmation that my clarity had been earned honestly, that I hadn't imagined the imbalance, that my role had indeed been more foundational than acknowledged. The consequences weren't loud. They didn't humiliate or punish. They educated. They taught him what had been quietly sustaining him, and what he no longer had access to. They taught others that my calm wasn't passivity, and my silence wasn't absence of resolve. And they taught me something too, that choosing myself didn't require anyone else's collapse. It didn't demand regret or apology. It simply required consistency. As the days passed, the distance became real. Not emotional distance, but structural separation. Lives unentangling, paths diverging. The future is no longer shared by default. The consequences had begun, and they were irreversible, not because I enforced them harshly, but because I no longer softened them for anyone else. There's a moment when people realize that adjustment is no longer possible. It doesn't arrive with shouting or pleading. It arrives quietly, disguised as concern, as reconsideration, as a sudden interest in repair. By the time that moment appears, the window for fixing things has already closed. It just hasn't been acknowledged yet. That's where he was. The messages changed tone again, less tentative now, more earnest. He asked if we could talk one last time, said he felt we were moving too fast, suggested that stress had distorted things, that maybe we both needed space before making final decisions. He used the word rushed. I remember reading that and feeling a brief, almost clinical irony. Nothing about my process had been rushed. If anything, it had been slow, patient, thorough, years in the making. What felt sudden to him was simply the moment I stopped absorbing delay on his behalf. We met once more, in person. Not because I needed it, but because I wanted to confirm something for myself. I chose a neutral space, public, calm, no emotional residue attached. He arrived looking different, on the sight, not devastated, but unsettled. As if he had expected sadness and instead encountered certainty, he talked carefully, choosing words that left room for interpretation. He spoke about confusion, about how the process had been overwhelming, about how he hadn't realized how much pressure I'd been under. He said, "I didn't know you were feeling this way." And I believed him. That wasn't the problem. The problem was that knowing now didn't change anything. I listened without interrupting, without correcting, without defending myself. I let him speak until his words ran out. Not because I was waiting for an apology, but because I was observing something important. He was trying to fix the ending, not the pattern. He wanted reassurance that he wasn't the kind of person who would use someone. He wanted the story softened, reframed into a mutual misunderstanding. He wanted emotional absolution without structural accountability. What he didn't ask, what he never asked, was whether I wanted to continue. When he finally paused, he looked at me expectantly, as if my response would determine whether this could still be salvaged. I spoke calmly. I told him that I understood stress, that I understood uncertainty. I even understood how people make choices without fully examining their implications. But I also told him that understanding wasn't the same as consent. I said the relationship no longer made sense to me, not emotionally, not ethically, not structurally, that the timing of his clarity coincided too precisely with the resolution of his uncertainty, that I had already adjusted my life accordingly. He looked stunned, not because of what I said, but because of how I said it. There was no anger to argue with, no bitterness to disarm, just finality. "That's it?" he asked quietly. "Yes," I said, and that was the moment he realized it was too late. Not because I was unforgiving, but because I was no longer available to be convinced. The version of me who explained, waited, hoped, that version had already stepped out of the conversation. What he was facing wasn't punishment. It was a consequence without negotiation. After that meeting, the urgency in his messages intensified briefly, then faded. He oscillated between regret and resignation, between self-reflection and self-protection. But the momentum had shifted. Nothing he said altered the trajectory anymore. Too late doesn't mean malicious. It means misaligned timing. He had begun to reflect only after the outcome he needed was secured, only after the risk had passed, only after my utility had reached its endpoint. And by then, I had already chosen myself. I didn't feel triumphant walking away from that meeting. I felt resolved. The kind of resolution that doesn't need witnesses. Some relationships don't end because love disappears. They end because clarity arrives too late for repair. Because awareness shows up after trust has already been reclassified as convenience. And once you see that clearly, there's nothing left to fix, only to finish. If you had asked me years earlier what confrontation looked like, I would have described raised voices, tears, and the urgent need to be understood. I would have imagined intensity as proof of truth, emotion as evidence that something mattered. What I learned instead is that the most definitive confrontations are almost quiet. By the time the final conversation happened, there was no fire left to manage, no anger to restrain. What remained was clarity, cool, steady, and impossible to misinterpret. We sat across from each other, not as adversaries, but as two people occupying different realities. He spoke first, carefully. There was an effort in his tone, as though precision might still change the outcome. He asked questions that circled the same point from different angles. Whether I was certain, whether I'd considered alternatives, whether time might change how I felt. I answered each one calmly. Yes, I was certain. Yes, I had considered everything. No, time would not change this. There was no edge in my voice, no tightening in my chest. I wasn't defending a decision. I was stating a fact. That's what disarmed him. People are prepared for confrontation when there's emotion to negotiate. Anger can be soothed. Sadness can be comforted. Doubt can be persuaded. But certainty offers no leverage. It doesn't escalate. It doesn't retreat. It simply exists. He tried briefly to reframe the past, to suggest that intentions mattered more than outcomes, that stress had distorted things, that love had been present, even if imperfectly expressed. I didn't argue. I said that intentions don't negate impact. That love, if it requires one person to disappear for the other to feel secure, isn't something I could build a future on. And that whatever had once existed between us no longer aligned with who I was now. He nodded slowly, as if absorbing a language he'd never needed to learn before. The conversation ended without resolution because resolution had already occurred elsewhere. This wasn't a negotiation, it was a notification. And strangely, there was relief in that. For both of us, he no longer had to guess whether things could be fixed. I no longer had to explain why they couldn't. The ambiguity that had lingered dissolved, replaced by a boundary so clear it required no enforcement. When we stood to leave, there was no dramatic goodbye, no final plea, just an acknowledgement that something had reached its natural conclusion. Not because it had been fought to death, but because it no longer served both people equally. Walking away, I felt light, not because I had won, but because I had stopped participating in something that demanded my erasure. That was the confrontation. No heat, no spectacle, no collapse. Just truth, delivered without urgency. And that, I learned, is what real power sounds like. Who I am now is not the opposite of who I was then. That's the part people often misunderstand. Growth isn't a rejection of your former self. It's a correction of what you were taught to tolerate. I didn't become harder. I didn't become colder. I became clearer. I'm still calm, still thoughtful, still capable of carrying weight. The difference is that I no longer carry what isn't mine. After the separation, life didn't transform overnight. There was no montage of reinvention, no sudden confidence, no dramatic declarations of freedom. What changed instead was the texture of my days, how decisions felt in my body, how silence felt when it was truly mine. For the first time in years, I noticed how much space I had internally, space that had once been occupied by anticipation, monitoring moods, managing outcomes, preemptively adjusting. That space didn't need to be filled. It simply existed. And in that existence, I felt more like myself than I had in a long time. I returned to parts of myself I hadn't lost, but had sidelined. Curiosity, discernment, the ability to say no without explanation. I stopped measuring my worth by how smoothly things ran around me. I stopped mistaking usefulness for intimacy. I stopped assuming that being chosen meant being valued. Instead, I began paying attention to reciprocity, not in a transactional way, but in a structural one. Did conversations move both ways? Did plans include my desires without prompting? Did silence feel safe, or did it feel like something I was responsible for repairing? These questions became quiet filters through which I experienced the world. People responded differently to me now. Some leaned in, intrigued by the steadiness that no longer bent to accommodate. Others drifted, uncomfortable without the version of me that anticipated their needs before they spoke. I let both happen, because who I am now doesn't require universal approval. I am someone who listens carefully and acts deliberately. Someone who understands that clarity is kinder than accommodation without consent. Someone who knows that dignity doesn't need to be loud to be firm. The experience didn't leave me cynical about love. It made me more precise about it. I no longer believe love is proven through endurance. I believe it's revealed through mutual consideration, especially when outcomes are uncertain. I believe partnership isn't about who holds things together, but about who notices when things are uneven. And most importantly, I no longer fear being misunderstood when I choose myself. There's a quiet confidence that comes from knowing you can walk away without anger, that you can end something without rewriting yourself to justify it, that you can stand alone without collapsing. That confidence doesn't announce itself. It shows up in how you pause before agreeing, in how you don't rush to fill the silence, in how you let people reveal who they are without correcting them. Who I am now is someone who trusts her observations, someone who knows that patience is powerful, but only when it's paired with self-respect. Someone who understands that the most important approval is not the one that arrives in the mail or in a message, but the one you give yourself when you stop betraying your own clarity. I didn't emerge from this louder. I emerged aligned. And alignment once found is not something you give away again. There is a temptation, at the end of stories like this, to offer a warning, to say, watch out, or don't be like me, or learn from my mistake. But that framing misses the point. I wasn't foolish. I wasn't naive. I wasn't weak. I was generous in a world that often rewards extraction. I believed in partnership in a system that quietly trains people to optimize outcomes. And for a long time, that belief looked like patience, adaptability, and restraint. Those qualities were never the problem. The problem was where I directed them. The moral of this story isn't that love is dangerous or that trust is a liability. It's that clarity must be reciprocal. That is when one person carries all the awareness, all the responsibility, all the emotional labor, something is already out of balance, long before betrayal becomes visible. What happened to me didn't begin with a breakup text. It began years earlier, when my silence was interpreted as consent and my steadiness was mistaken for inexhaustibility, when my willingness to understand replaced the other person's obligation to consider. The quiet truth is this: most people don't hurt others because they are cruel. They hurt others because they are comfortable. Comfort dulls curiosity. It delays accountability. It teaches people to take without checking whether anything is being lost in the process. And when clarity finally arrives, when the structure they relied on steps back, it often feels sudden to them, unfair, abrupt. But it isn't. It's simply no longer buffered. I didn't leave with anger. I didn't expose or humiliate or demand regret. I left with alignment, with the kind of self-respect that doesn't require witnesses or validation. If there's one thing I hope stays with you after listening to this, it's this. Pay attention to who becomes clearer when uncertainty ends. Notice who leans in only after the risk passes. Notice who asks how you feel once outcomes are secured. Those moments tell you more than declarations ever could. And if you recognize yourself in my story, if you've been the steady one, the quiet one, the one who makes things work, know this: your silence is not invisibility unless you agree to let it be. Observation is not passivity, and choosing yourself doesn't require burning anything down. Sometimes, it only requires stepping aside and letting the truth stand on its own. I'm sharing this not for sympathy, not for validation, but for resonance, because somewhere, someone is listening to this and realizing that the discomfort they've been minimizing has a shape, a pattern, a name. And that realization might be the beginning of their own clarity. So, I'll leave you with one question: open, honest, and yours to answer if you choose. Have you ever looked back and realized the moment you thought you were being patient was actually the moment you stopped being fully seen? If you feel comfortable, I'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments.